Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third debate hosted on Seeking Eye. This is between, I wanted to say doctor, but he's not a doctor, Cyrus Kirkpatrick and TJump, otherwise known as Tom to his friends. This is on the subject of, is there evidence for an afterlife, or is there reason to believe in life after death? Essentially the same thing, but because of the wisdom of the people that designed the length of characters for the YouTube titles, I had to condense it down on there. So it's, is there evidence for an afterlife? Cyrus will be taking the positive position and Tom will be taking the negative position. So what we're going to do, same as last time, the main priority here is to maintain a respectful intellectual discussion, no picking at each other in the chat and between Cyrus and Tom, who I know that won't be a problem. So what we're going to do, same as last time, 5 minutes introduction from each person. Cyrus is going to begin, followed by 1 hour of open discussion, or at least capped at 1 hour, but it may end early if the discussion comes to a stop. And then following that is questions and answers. So if you have any questions for either Cyrus or Tom, then just leave them in the chat and I will take a note and ask them if and when they come. So Cyrus, if you would like to begin with your introduction on the subject.
Hi.
Is there reason to believe in life after death? Sorry, all yours.
No problem. Sure. Okay. So I'm live. You got me? All right. All right. Well, thanks for having me here. And as you know, I'm taking the positive position about life after death. So I've been writing about this subject for a while. I have a couple of books out, actually 3 books total. And there's about 30 areas of evidence of an afterlife that I've talked about, at least since I began doing this type of work. And really, I take an evidence-based approach. Now, I think it's not an enviable position to say on absolute terms that there is no afterlife, because to do so, you're basically on a defensive the entire time. And this has to do with the white crow analogy. It only takes one white crow to prove that not all crows are black. If there's been 100 million supernatural experiences that people have had, and I'm just tossing a number out, all it would take is just one to toss the materialism philosophy into a tizzy. So there's many areas of evidence that I talk about and go over. One that I could just begin things with are, of course, near-death experiences. So as we all know, there is a lot of skeptical literature about NDEs, but if you go deeper into the phenomena surrounding NDEs, there's a lot there that's difficult to dismiss. And so I am going to cite quite a bit from Victor Zamet's work, from his Lawyer Presents the Case for the Afterlife website, just for basically reference. But I can mention a few points right off the bat about the NDE, for example, the way that, let's see, there's been veridical information that has been obtained from people having NDEs. One example of that is people who are blind, sometimes from birth, who go into the near-death state and they're able to see for the first time. So in the book Mindsight, Dr. Ken Ring and Sharon Cooper report on in-depth interviews with 31 people who were fully or partially blind and had a near-death experience where they were able to see for the first time. One of their subjects was Vicky Noratuk, who had been blind from birth. She could not even see the color black. During her NDE, she found she could see for the first time. She recognized her wedding ring and her hair. She also saw people made out of light, although she didn't have a conception of what light was prior to the NDE. That's by Ring and Cooper, 1999. There is, for example, Pim Van Lommel's work, which includes many very interesting studies. There's a 5-year-old girl who told him that she had been with a brother she did not know she even had. The boy had died before she was born, met him during a near-death experience. There's, of course, Eben Alexander. We all know it's a very famous story, but in that account, he met a young girl that he didn't know who she was. Later was able to identify her as an adopted sister that was separated at birth. There was quite a few more like this. I could probably just go on and on like this, and I know I'm on a 5-minute crunch, and that's just near-death experiences. I could jump into the cross correspondences, which was a incident that happened in the 1900s when a parapsychological researcher, one of the founders of the SPR, Frederick Myers, had basically set up a test to verify the existence of mediums by sort of creating this jigsaw puzzle that could only be solved when different mediums in different parts of the world were able to put those pieces together. This was a time long before the internet, and also it was a blinded study, so there was no way they could individually figure out what the puzzle was. And the main communicator was actually Frederick Myers himself, who passed away in 1901 and became the facilitator from beyond of that. And then finally, I'm just kind of guesstimating if we're at 5 minutes or not. So there's many areas that I could go on and on about, but when you combine into the mix your own experience, is that it? Okay. 30 seconds, I'm sorry. When you combine into the mix your own experiences, then it's very difficult to logically say that there's nothing there. Like maybe I used to be more like Tom as a skeptic, but when you take all of these areas and then you begin having out-of-body experiences, you begin having after-death contacts, you begin having lucid, tangible experiences in what we'd call another realm, then at that point, there just isn't any way to put those pieces together without looking at the big picture, that there's other dimensions of reality that we can interact with. And I just can't find a logical way to be able to still be a materialist. And so I'm happy to basically be pursuing this line of inquiry in the most logical way.
Gonna have to stop you there, but that's great, thanks. I know that 5 minutes generally isn't enough to really delve into this sort of thing, but I know there are other areas that you'd like to go into with your own personal experiences as well. So Tom, it's over to you now for your 5-minute introduction, so please go ahead.
Sure. So I am a materialist physicalist, like the vast majority of academics in every academic field, because all of the evidence indicates materialism, and there is absolutely no evidence for anything beyond materialism. It's pretty simple that evidence is testable predictions. You need to be able to predict something in the future we don't know yet. The reason for this is because there's infinitely many ways to explain anything, literally anything. So if we imagine a cup fell over, well, what caused that cup to fall over? Well, maybe it was the wind or a squirrel or a bird or someone bumped the table, or maybe it was invisible aliens or psychic powers or a god. There's infinitely many ways you could explain what caused the cup to fall over. But what matters is how can you differentiate all those imaginary ones from the one real one that actually caused the cup to fall over. And the way we do that is we have some method that can differentiate imagination from reality, and that method is novel testable predictions. If I can say, I think a squirrel knocked over the cup, and if a squirrel knocked over the cup, I can find squirrel droppings around the cup when we look, and then we look and find squirrel droppings, that's really good evidence that my hypothesis was the correct one and all the others were imaginary. And the reason this is important is because any imaginary hypothesis can explain all of the data post hoc. After you see the squirrel droppings, you could say, it was magical pixies, and they knocked the cup over and then placed the squirrel droppings there to make it look like a squirrel. You can always post hoc rationalize anything because we have a very vivid imagination. And so no amount of post hoc reasoning of saying, oh, here's an event we can't explain, and I can explain it with some made up explanation, ever counts as evidence. And that's pretty much all we have for near-death experiences, an afterlife, souls, all that stuff. The only thing we have is, well, we can imagine an explanation, but there's no actual evidence that they're true. It's just post hoc reasoning, which is why science has and philosophy have developed these extra criteria that are required for something to count as evidence, because anyone can do that. We know those methodologies do not work. They've been proven to fail time and time again throughout history, and so we've ruled out that as being reasonable evidence to believe anything. It's just that can't differentiate your imagination from reality, and so that isn't a form of evidence. That's why we need novel testable predictions. And so until we actually have novel testable predictions that can demonstrate something more than materialism, then there's no reason to believe there's anything more than materialism, because it's the only thing that does make novel testable predictions. So until my Cyrus introduces some novel testable predictions that can indicate the existence of the afterlife, then there is conclusively no reason to believe there's afterlife, which is the consensus in neurology, psychology, physics, cosmology, every academic field, philosophy of mind. There is no evidence of anything beyond the physical, because none of it has ever been able to make testable predictions. And I will conclude there.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Tom. Certainly some very valid points to go over between both speakers. So what I'll do now, if if the gods of technology will allow it to happen, is I'll bring up my countdown. If it's mirrored for anybody, I'm sorry, there's not much I can do about it. So hopefully it won't be, but I shall bring this up now, and you now have 1 hour, gentlemen, to discuss. Over to you.
Okay, to me. Okay. All right then. So, well, first of all, if we're going to appeal to authority, which is basically what you did by saying that there's every quote, every institution believes in this. This is not true. There is of competing philosophies. That's the open-minded nature of science, the way it should be. Science controlled by materialism as a philosophy will never be open-minded. It will actually be fit into its own kind of dogma. Part of that problem is actually when somebody self-identifies themselves belonging to the tribe of, say, I'm a materialist, I'm an atheist. I think that can be very problematic, but that's a little bit beside the point. There's been many famous scientists throughout history, if we're going to appeal to authority, who investigated the afterlife and were completely convinced of it. For example, so we have Sir Oliver Lodge, a professor of physics at the University of Liverpool and a pioneer of radiology, electricity, and radio. We had Sir William Barrett, a professor of physics at the Royal College of Dublin, who developed the silicon iron alloy, important to the development of the telephone. We have Camille Flammarion, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, founder of the French Astronomical Society, Professor Charles Richet, a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, many others, not to mention Sir William Crookes, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-originator with Charles Darwin of natural selection. And these were people who investigated psychic phenomena back in the heyday. Now, the next issue is I could actually sit here all night and present information to Tom that is blinded experiments, things like that, which he will probably reject because we're going into the basis that anything I say is going to be wrong. The study has to be invalid. It has to be, there has to be something wrong with it because it's always going to be a prosecutor's argument against it. I can talk about the Windbridge Institute, multi-blind experiments in mediumship. I can talk about Gary Schwartz, University of Arizona, multi-blind experiments in, again, mediumship, confirming in some extraordinary conditions about information coming in that couldn't be explained throughout some kind of a mechanism that's extending beyond the mind. I can talk about the University of Virginia reincarnation researcher, Dr. Ian Stevenson, with 4,000 case studies of reincarnation, including physical evidence. And all of that's available if anyone wants to inquire about that. And I'm happy to recite, what's at least in my memory banks and a few notes, but it's probably not going to be perfect. So again, to be able to take Tom's position, it has to be where you're constantly defending the materialist status quo from this barrage of evidence, and it's not an enviable position. And again, I could go over many areas of research and studies in this area, and nothing will ever progress so long as materialist academics think of themselves as gatekeepers who are unwilling to expand the boundaries of consciousness. That's my response. I'll send it back to you, Tom.
Yeah, I'd like to address that last point. You said nothing will progress as long as materialist dogma or whatever. Well, that's just patently false. Like if you have a discovery and everyone else is biased against you and your discovery actually does something in the world, you win. This was the case with guns. The Japanese were totally against guns and Western technology, but the Western technology won because they had guns. Their technology did something. It had a real effect in the world. So it doesn't matter the biases that everyone could have biases. It's not going to stop a bullet. So technology works if it has a real impact in the world. Biases mean nothing. So the only thing a bias can do is it can say, I have a conceptual framework that doesn't allow for this. Therefore, I'm not going to listen to the data, to the words that you've given, but that can't change empirical evidence. So it can't change the facts about the world. So that's why this is one of the common claims of pseudoscience, is one of the lists of what qualifies as a pseudoscience is when you claim your detractors have a bias or a dogma. That's just false. The whole point of consensus is because it eradicates all bias necessarily. Everybody has their own bias. Everybody in science hates everybody else's paper because the way you get famous in science is by proving everybody else wrong. So if you can say that I have an idea and my idea is true, then every other scientist is going to try and prove it wrong. They all have biases against it. They all want to prove it wrong. And if they can't, that's the idea that goes forward. So they're not treating your ideas any differently than any other scientist's ideas. The difference is your ideas fail 100% of the time. They do nothing. All they are is you have an imagined explanation for something. and you can't go beyond that. Like, the whole point of evidence is to be able to go beyond that. You need to demonstrate something in the world independent of your imagination. And if you can't do that, it's not evidence. And what you mentioned earlier, appeal to authority, like, no, I did not appeal to authority, because an appeal to authority is only fallacious if they're not real authorities. And the consensus of people who work in the field are actual authorities. It's literally listed number 9 on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The appeal to authority fallacy is only fallacious when not talking about actual experts in the field. And so I didn't use an appeal to authority fallacy. I used actual evidence, which is the people who are qualified to assess all of the evidence you listed. They found it completely garbage. So the best way to know, since I can't actually like go and repeat these studies on my own, I can't like literally just have $1 million to pay people to fly across the world and do all this stuff for me. But there are scientists who do that, and they found everything you've listed completely false. I mean, and bias is filtered out. There's no bias here. It's just literally it doesn't work. It's that simple. That's kind of the point of consensus. Everyone had a bias against Einstein because he said space-time could bend, and that's a logical contradiction for most philosophers, but it worked. It made a testable prediction, so no one got an opinion anymore. That's how evidence works. So there isn't a bias and a dogma here. It's just simply how evidence works. And listing many scientists who believe it, that's an anecdotal fallacy. What isn't an anecdotal fallacy is when you list the consensus of all of the experts in the field. That's not an anecdotal fallacy. So just listing a couple of scientists who disagree, well, yeah, you can find that in any field. You can find scientists who disbelieve in climate change. You can find scientists who are young earth creationists. You can find all kinds of silly scientists who believe silly things. That's not evidence. What is evidence is what is the consensus of experts everywhere in the world believe, because that's what works. So it's not an appeal to authority fallacy, what I did. There isn't a bias and dogma. And if your theory actually worked, it would make progress regardless of whether or not we had any biases, which kind of undercuts your whole argument.
You finished?
Yep, go on.
Okay. Okay, so let's for a second go into the so-called pseudoscience and things that have no effect on the greater reality. But first of all, let me preface that by saying that we're dealing with multi-dimensions, an area of science that is obviously new. It's, I think, I don't know how to say it, maybe spoiled to believe that a new area of science with phenomena that's happening has to meet this criteria where you have to be able to put it in a test tube and make a product out of it, because that's sort of how materialist science and, the world really operates, is that, what can we do with this? How can we push industry forward? How can we create something? How can we create microprocessors? How can we advance society? Well, it's difficult to do that when we're dealing with an area of inquiry that involves dimensions that are not connected to this one. But let's look at the fact that there is, in fact, branches of non-material physics which are implemented. So one example is remote viewing. So I'm just going to read off a couple of quotes from some, I think, just like you're saying, this is not an appeal to authority because these people are actual credible people. Well, I think the same can be said for somebody like Major General Edmund R. Thompson, U.S. Army Assistant Chief of Staff of Intelligence from 1977 to 81, and Deputy Director for Management and Operations at the Defense Intelligence Agency. In regard to remote viewing, he says, I never like to get into debates with the skeptics, which is exactly what I'm doing here now for some reason, I don't know. Because if you didn't believe that remote viewing was real, you hadn't done your homework. Here's another quote by former President Jimmy Carter recalling a 1978 remote viewing operation. The remote viewer went into a trance, and while she was in the trance, she gave us some latitude and longitude figures. We focused our satellite cameras on that point, and the lost plane was found. Now, all of these can be researched if someone is actually willing to do the homework and look into a topic like remote viewing. There's people, I'm aware of some private contractors in the remote viewing field who make ridiculous amounts of money doing remote viewing operations basically to attack competitor companies. And from what I've heard from some of these folks, like John Vivanco is one name that pops into my head, is that the fewer the people who are aware of the technology and how powerful it is, the better it is for the people operating in those fields, because they have an advantage on the company, on the foreign government that doesn't believe that the technology is real. And they're able to obtain information this way, which would completely completely catch a competitor off guard. So I'm very aware of private remote viewing contracting companies that make ridiculous amounts of money with very intelligent businesses, even governments. I believe that the Vivanco's company was contracted by the US government to look for terrorists in the early 2000s. Would these respectable institutions, smart people in business, smart people in government, be contracting remote viewing if there was nothing to it? Now, let me just continue and say, I can again probably be here all night and reference specific cases, specific things that demonstrate a very strong case of something happening that was of a non-materialist nature, something happening outside the mind. But I'm pretty sure, because I've been doing these debates with folks like Tom for a long time, nothing's going to amount to anything. It's going to be basically talking to a brick wall. So really, I'm doing this for people who are watching, who are curious about digging deeper into the information. Unfortunately, I don't think any minds between both Tom and I are going to be changed tonight. But again, I've done the research, and I've looked into over 30 areas. And I'm sorry, I'll finish now. So that's my response.
I just wanted to jump in very quickly and just say, Cyrus, can we just refrain from making claims like Tom is a brick wall or vice versa, because let's not question the openness of the other person.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm fine with that. I mean, that's a common thing of pseudoscience is you always claim your opponent is biased, and that's why they don't accept your evidence. You can never accept that. It's just bad evidence. You mentioned the criteria that we need to build something in a test tube. Well, that's not the criteria. As I said in my opening, the criteria is you need some way to differentiate, is it imaginary or is it real? You need to provide some methodology that can do that. And you can't. That's why all of the evidence is rejected, because you can't do that. All you have is post hoc reasoning. The methodologies used and all of the evidence you gave don't qualify as real evidence because they just use post hoc reasoning, and they can't actually do anything. The fact that lots of people make money off this, there was a guy who was paid millions of dollars to draw water from a rock in Nigeria. That just means the people in Nigeria were gullible. It doesn't mean they could actually do it. The fact that he made lots of money isn't evidence it's true. So again, you would need to provide some way to differentiate, is this real in reality, or is it just in their heads in imagination land? That's the question that we need to answer. Just giving a bunch of examples of people who imagine it works and give people money isn't evidence. So nothing you presented gives us a way to differentiate, well, is this real or is this imaginary? All you've given is a whole bunch of anecdotes from Jimmy Carter, who isn't an expert, anecdotes from a military guy who isn't an expert. Neither of these people are qualified to test anything in the field of science. And they're only individual anyway. So again, individual anecdotes aren't evidence even of experts. You need to quote the consensus. Those are the people who are actually qualified, not individuals, because individuals are biased. That's the point of the consensus. It weeds out the bias. So I don't know what you mean by there's evidence of things, non-material things happening in nature. Like if you saw it, it must have been material because your eyes see photons. So it has to have been something material. It must have happened. I don't know how you could have evidence of something non-material. You'd only have, unless you made predictions of some kind. If you have predictions, please let me know. But yeah, like your example of the government officials, James Randi and his two apprentices did the exact same thing, where they fooled officials into believing in magic and psychic powers pretty easily, because people are very easily gullible. And that's why you need the consensus and peer review to double check all of the work, because people are gullible. So as far as I know, all of the attempts to replicate all parapsychology have all failed 100% of the time when replicated, which is why it's not really taken very seriously. So again, I need you to give me some way to differentiate, like tell me your method to differentiate imagination from reality, and then show me something that can follow that method to get reliable results. I mean, like if you can really do, like you mentioned, if there are really people who can use parapsychology and there's this new technology that no one else has discovered yet, you're going to have a massive advantage over everybody else. If you could just tell the lottery numbers consistently and post it on YouTube beforehand, and when we just wait X number of years or whatever, and you get it right X number of times, that's great evidence. You have now win a Nobel Prize because you have demonstrated that there is some kind of parapsychology there with very high levels of accuracy. Nobody's done that. James Randi offered $1 million challenge for anybody who could demonstrate this. Nobody's done that. And this is not the only one. There's lots of these. It's really easy to demonstrate this if it was real. All you have to do is just go on YouTube, make a whole bunch of predictions, get them like a year beforehand, get them all right. You've got great evidence. The problem is no one's done that. And it shouldn't be too hard if it was real.
Okay, I'll reply. So first of all, Randy's prize is just probably one of the most ridiculous things that's ever come out of anywhere. There's a great book about this called Randy's Prize, but I think it's Robert McLuhan, and talks about just the duplicitous nature of that whole scene and how Randy, when actually faced by challengers who were ready to take him on, basically ran away like a coward. So but this is going to be like probably a matter of opinion at that point. It's probably not going to add much to the debate, but anytime people bring up Randy's Prize, which is somehow still being resurrected through some kind of necromancy from beyond the grave, that is, something I like to respond with, because this whole area requires large amounts of critical thinking. When there's an authoritative opinion that something is the way it is, you have to think outside the box a little bit, because there's still, as I've mentioned, there's this ocean of evidence, ocean of phenomena, ocean of different topics that I can get into. So next is this idea that people should be predicting the lottery numbers. Well, there is no reason to suspect that predicting specific numbers is a element of psi or some element of the consciousness acting outside of the mind. For all we know, predicting the future is impossible. That doesn't mean that non-materialist phenomena is also impossible. Maybe the future is not determined. Maybe it's not possible to know certain or be able to use quote psychic powers for certain things. We don't know all the mechanisms. So basically what you're doing is you're setting the subject up for failure by saying it has to follow these guidelines to be able to be a real thing. If it doesn't follow my guideline I set up that you have to find lottery numbers, then we have to toss it all out the window. I disagree with that. I think that's basically just setting someone's argument up for failure. It's not the way it works. Now, again, I can go into multi-blinded experiments. I can go into the research, but I don't think it's going to make a big difference, except to say that people watching can do their own homework. There's excellent accounts of things in Dean Radin's latest book, which is called Real Magic, and laboratory experiments concerning psi, concerning macro PK, many things like this, which, I understand that this is a contested area, and it's also the way that it should operate, because I've seen glimpses of how the scientific institution operates, and it is funny how this subject does get treated with the same scrutiny that you'll see like a new medicine get treated with. It's very, very difficult to get things through that bubble, and I guess in some ways that is a good thing, because it's what protects society to only be able to operate within parameters that really are helping society and not leading to, for example, false cures or false medicine. So I get that, and I respect that as well. But it doesn't mean that, again, these specific incidences, specific phenomena can be dismissed. It just means that, it's going to be a while until the scientific establishment is able to, provide some wiggle room. But let me just jump in real quick and mention again about, for example, just one topic that comes to mind as a journalist and just as a researcher is the cross correspondences. So let me just reference real quick more about how that operated. So the idea was there'd be a series of messages in different mediums in different parts of the world that on their own would mean nothing, but which when put together would make sense. So if him and fellow leaders of the Society for Psychical Research, which included some big names in science at the time, felt that if it could be done, it would be able to provide a high level of evidence. And in all, more than 3,000 scripts were transmitted over 30 years. Some of them were more than 40 type pages long. Together they filled 24 volumes and 12,000 pages. The investigation went on so long that some of the investigators actually passed away during the process. The mediums used by Myers and others were not professors of the classics. They were not highly educated. All messages transmitted were outside their learned knowledge and experience. And basically, in summary, these messages were confirmed because individually they didn't make any sense. They had to be all put together at once. And this was a research project that took 30 years to put together. And it basically, if anyone wants to go into that phenomenon and dig into what happened, it's startling the level of evidence that it produced. So as a researcher, as a journalist, when I study, even things from the annals of history like this, I can't look at that and then just dismiss it because of a platitude, because, extraordinary claims, or why don't they have the lottery numbers? To me, that is kind of bad science. I'm not a scientist, but it's just irresponsible to dismiss a phenomena because of a opinion about, for example, lottery numbers or Randy's prize. To me, these things are irrelevant. What matters is the data. What matters is the phenomena that's been recorded. And finally, there is such a thing as a courtroom evidence. So that's often what I operate under when talking about this subject. If we go strictly under scientific evidence, then look, I think that it's going to be really difficult to measure and test and put in a bottle multidimensional types of things. But when we look at things from a courtroom perspective, then it really changes. It kind of slides into a more convincing area. And then finally, we put in the personal experiences, and it just all adds up to me. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about courtroom versus scientific evidence, but I'll turn it back to you.
Before you jump
Sure.
in,
So there's a number of
can
things
I-
you
can
mentioned
I-
there. One,
Sorry, can I just quickly mention that although this area is interesting, can we please try and make sure that we bring this back to the subject of life after death, as opposed to is there non-physical phenomena such as this, although as interesting as it is?
it's the same thing. So it's just, you could just change the noun to everything he said and it would be the same argument. So to address what he said, you mentioned there is this experiment they did where they had different people doing different viewings and they had to combine the message. So they all got different messages and it only made sense when they combined it. Okay, do it again. Just do it right now. Go do an experiment, record it on YouTube. With controlled environments, there you have your evidence.
I hope they do, because Schwartz's lab does stuff like this all the time. They actually, one of the experiments they did was with I think it was a $20,000.
Sorry, I got like a bunch of points here I want to address. So do it again, post it on YouTube. That's great evidence. Until you can, then it's just hearsay. And you mentioned courtroom evidence. Courtroom evidence works the exact same way as scientific evidence. Testimony is only evidence of things that already has an empirical basis. If I said, I saw a dog, that's reasonable to believe because we already know dogs exist. There's tons of implicit empirical evidence in the word dog, like its genetic makeup, chemical composition, phylogeny, homology, what it's allergic to, how to train it. There's tons of empirical evidence of dogs. So if I said I saw a dog, it's reasonable to believe my testimony. If I said I saw a unicorn, you should never believe that testimony at all. Testimony is completely insufficient to justify the belief I actually saw a living, breathing unicorn until I can provide some empirical evidence of the unicorn outside of that. This same criteria is used in every courtroom. It's called precedent. If you say, I saw that person was killed with a magic wand and a green light came out where he said, Avada Kedavra, you would instantly be thrown out of the courtroom because there's no precedent for that occurring. You would first need to demonstrate the phenomenon exists in reality independent of your testimony, or it would be thrown out. Same with evidence or aliens, same with God, same with the supernatural. Because those things don't have precedence, they are instantly tossed in a courtroom. And there's tons of examples. I actually did a debate with Jonathan Sheffield where I listed a bunch of these in the debate. I found them a long time ago, so I don't have them off the top of my head. But yeah, courtroom, exact same evidence as science. If you don't have an empirical basis, it's immediately thrown out because it's precedent, doesn't have any precedent. So I'm using courtroom evidence here too. Science, you said science needs to provide wiggle room. Like, no, science doesn't need to provide any wiggle room, because the reason science has the standards it does is because these standards are the ones that can differentiate imagination and reality. That is what evidence is. It doesn't, asking science to lower its standard to meet your.
I don't think I said that. Just let me cut in. I think I said I understand why science does not have much wiggle room. I think that's what I said, because I was referencing how, for medicine, for example, or for many different areas,
I think
science has to be very rigid.
Yeah, when you're talking about the medicine thing, I'm referring to when you said that as long as the scientists have this bias, they will never be able to accept this evidence. That was something along those lines.
I think I might have said that like a while back, and so you're combining those points together. So
Well,
yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
we can go it back. You said science provide wiggle room. So science doesn't need to provide you with any wiggle room. You need to meet the standard of evidence that everybody else needs to meet, because that's how we differentiate imagination from reality. If you can't do that, then you're admitting you have no evidence. You're admitting that you can't differentiate. Is this just imaginary in your head? And if it's real, you have nothing. That's the point. That's the whole point of science. Is this is the criteria we use to differentiate imagination from reality. Lowering it just means that you can't do that, so it's not evidence. So predicting specific numbers, you mentioned predicting lottery numbers. That's just an example. It doesn't matter what the predictions are. You could predict whatever you want. You could predict events, predict the next 6 presidents or whatever. I don't care. It was just an example. If you can make successful novel predictions reliably and have some method that can be used for other people to make predictions, that's evidence. That's all you need. You said that we can't predict the future. Well, no, that's wrong. Science literally does predict the future. That's for everything. That's what novel tested predictions are. With using Einstein's general special relativity, you can predict the motion of stars, the bending of light, the gravitational waves. We literally predict the future in every scientific experiment. So yours needs to do the same. You need to be able to make a prediction of something we don't know yet, like lottery numbers is one example. It could be anything you want, and then say, we will do this method of this parapsychology viewing thing, and it will get this result, and then record it on YouTube or whatever in front of the Guinness Book of World Records or any peer-reviewed paper and publish it. And that is evidence. Until you have that, you don't have evidence. So it's not science lowering its standard. You need to have actual evidence, not just say, list a bunch of anecdotes and people's opinions that can't be verified. And if you have evidence, then we should be able to repeat it. We should have some kind of a method that can say, so if we do this, we get this result. All right, well, we the scientists will test that and be like, okay, we'll do it and see if we get the result, and it should work. And if it does, then you're right, you get a Nobel Prize. But that's never been done, which is why scientists don't accept it. There's no bias in science. It's just facts. If you have the facts, you win.
Okay, so a couple things. First of all, the idea there's no bias in science basically contradicts human nature itself. It's almost like talking about a utopia system where scientists are automatically these infallible beings who completely neutral. They have no kind of subjective opinion at all. And maybe in a perfect world, like if we're wherever planet Spock came from, then it might be like that. But unfortunately, we know that that's not how it is in real life. Now, secondly, I wish they would replicate cross correspondences. It's very difficult to get funding in this area, to get any institution to take it seriously. Now, let's look at Dr. Gary Schwartz. One of his experiments was involving a photon detection unit. So it's about a $20,000 piece of device. And his hypothesis was that if he's communicating via mediums with spirits, talking about the afterlife, they should be able to somehow alter the physical environment around us. In this case, maybe creating tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of light. So if we could talk to a medium and have them alter the level of photons in a pitch black room, so like with zero light contamination, then this would be substantial evidence that there is some kind of a communication attempt. So this was I believe it was a double-blinded experiment, very, very thorough. And what he basically had is that this photon detection unit was inside of this completely sealed environment. And the idea would be to have mediums in a blinded condition attempt to speak to the hypothesized spirit communicator to go into the room and alter the level of photons. So the results of that experiment were, of course, published in the journal might have been Explorer. I don't remember which one it was. And you can look at the graphs in my first book, or also one of Schwartz's books, and it's way, way, way beyond the measure of chance. The p-values are crazy concerning how when the mediums at specific moments were having the alleged spirit communicators enter the sealed chamber, the level of photons in that room went up. Now, I kind of already know what's going to be said. Well, why don't they duplicate it? Well, they should, and they are working on that as we speak. I believe I had Mark Pitstick on my show not that long ago, and he's also working with Schwartz, and he's alleging that these different universities are also working on that.
How long ago was that photon steel room?
I think it was 2014, maybe. I'm just pulling that off the top of my head, maybe 2013. But there's been ongoing experiments in that area, and there's a lot, just here at the University of Arizona. So
they've had 6 years to reproduce this, and they could have posted it on YouTube for free. You don't need funding for this.
What's this stuff about YouTube? It's not. First of all, you need funding because the unit was $20,000, so he had to fund that, and then he has multiple lab assistants. I mean, he actually has a whole setup. So
if you can generate photons in a dark room, you don't need lab assistants. You can just go to a dark room and generate.
No, because then it would be a faulty experiment. I mean, there's so many ways that the experiment would not, that you would argue against if you had some amateur with like a sealed box. There's so many ways.
There's infinitely many ways you can corrupt any experiment. We know that for sure. That's kind of the point of repeatability. So you need to provide a method, do the experiment, and then show the results of the experiment, then other people need to repeat it. So it doesn't make a difference. I don't care how you falsified it or how you could have falsified it. All that matters is, can I repeat it? Can I go to a dark room and generate photons, or whatever method you want to use to do it? So it makes no difference what room. You don't need a $20,000 box. You don't need assistants. You need to go to a dark room. You need to generate photons. You need to publish the method and then let people repeat it on their own. That's all you need to do. This does not take funding. Most scientific research doesn't really take that much funding. That's usually just for the Large Hadron Collider and stuff, because those take really big equipment to build. If all you're doing is talking to the dead and you don't need a big machine to do it, you can do it for free on YouTube. So if you've had 6 years to do it and you haven't been able to just post a method to do this to get this result, it's probably fake.
Guaranteed.
30 minutes, gentlemen. 30 minutes.
So go on.
Just saying 30 minutes.
Okay, so guaranteed, if some Yahoo replicated Schwartz's experiment and put it on YouTube, you would be right here saying this is not evidence. This is some Yahoo and YouTube replicating experiment without any protocols in place, without using the proper equipment, on and on and on and on. So I don't think you actually take junk on YouTube as serious evidence, just like I don't really take junk on YouTube as serious evidence. Now, if it's
not about the YouTube here. The point is, if you can show a method works, the method, and I can go to my room and replicate the method. That's the proof. It doesn't matter if it's on YouTube or anywhere. You just need to provide a method.
That's a completely impossible standard that you can go into your room and replicate something. So we can do it with basic science experiments.
That's a straw man. So that doesn't make a difference if I can literally replicate it in my room. The point is, you need to provide a method, and then we need to be able to replicate the method. That's all you need. It doesn't matter if you post it on YouTube or Twitch or Twitter. If you provide a method that can be repeated and we can repeat it with fairly easy means and it works, that's all you need. That's literally it. Like Einstein, his experiment was, you can measure the curvature of light around the sun. Anybody with a telescope can do it. And they did. That's all you need.
Okay, so look, I had a small epiphany. Maybe this will help the debate out. I feel like the issue is that we're dealing with an area of science that is not fully understood. So the idea that we can take that standard into something you can replicate in your room, well, to say that's unfair is an understatement. But
the room is irrelevant here. You keep getting hung up on these little particulars. Like the room doesn't matter. Like
using those examples. Don't use those examples.
Excuse me.
So the examples I'm using are just examples. You can pick whatever examples you want. You get to tell me what the method is.
Excuse me, Tom. I'm talking here. Please, could we not talk over each other, because it gets confusing. I struggle to hear what people are saying, and so I'm sure does the audience. So let's continue to speak one at a time, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so the particulars don't matter. You can tell me the particulars. You need to give me a method. So we're saying that, it needs to be repeated in the room. Like, no, that's a straw man. That's not my point. You can tell me the method. Just give me a method.
Okay, get a $20,000 photon detection unit and put it in a verifiably sealed box, and use double-blinded conditions with a team of mediums and assistants in a laboratory, and repeat Schwartz's experiment. Look, I think that it should be repeated. It's very difficult to, number one, get funding, and number two, get a university or an institution to take something seriously enough to be able to actually realistically repeat experiments. I mean, for example, Schwartz is entirely privately funded, so he has an office at the University of Arizona, but because of the nature of what he does and the fact that there's basically, gatekeepers, people who have the same, I'm not saying this in a derogatory way at all, I'm just saying people have the same mindset or opinion or way of approaching this as yourself, it's very, very difficult to get funding. So it's a self-funding of events. So these are some of the issues concerning this line of research. Dean Radin talks about this a lot too.
Well, no, I already proved that false. So no, there is no bias. We can literally prove there's no bias because that's what consensus does. Every individual has a bias. Like you said, every human being has a bias. And if everyone's bias is that I'm right and you're wrong, and you present an idea, that means every other human being is trying to prove your idea wrong. And the consensus is when they can't. When everyone fails to prove your idea wrong, it wins. That means all of the biases have been eliminated. There's no bias because the whole point of the bias is to kill that idea, and they can't. So consensus figures out bias. So there's no bias here. All you need to do is provide an idea that can't be destroyed. And you haven't. All you said is get a $20,000 detector. Like, no, you don't need this. If you had a real result, you wouldn't need a $20,000 detector. There's lots of ways to detect photons without that. It's like Einstein's experiment. You took a telescope, you pointed it at the sun. That's all you need. No $20,000 required here. It's pretty simple. All realistic things are pretty simple to repeat.
Okay, so let's just go from that example, and we'll just say hypothetically, because I mean Schwartz is the scientist, and he's actually a Harvard brain surgeon and numerous other degrees. I don't know exactly why he would need the $20,000 equipment, but I presume it's to just guarantee the authenticity of the test. There's no room for error. There's no room for, let's say, the machine itself creating a photon, right? So imagine that you have a cheap photon detection unit inside of this sealed environment, and then there's some mechanism inside the unit which causes the photons to appear, right? And then that corresponds to when they do the test. So there's different ways that an experiment could be falsified or could go to hell. So maybe this is why he invested into an expensive unit. But let's just hypothetically use your example. So let's say we could replicate that experiment. Well, I'm not aware of anyone replicating the experiment positively or negatively, because there isn't interest. There isn't interest in academia to look at that work except in specific circles. So Schwartz is Schwartz, and there's people in and around Schwartz's experiments, and there might be odd place, like maybe Princeton. I mean, Princeton University has a parapsychology lab. Of course, University of Virginia studies reincarnation and similar things. But it's very, very difficult to find a network that basically is willing to repeat these experiments, but it has to be done with a level of sophistication. It has to replicate the variables that were in place, for example, when Schwartz did it, which again, it's not, he wasn't doing it, half-assed. He didn't close a bedroom door, make it dark, and then put a cheap device in there to check for photons. This was an elaborate experiment. So I really have to copy those protocols so that yeah. So, okay. Well, if you don't, then that's great.
It's really simple. I think you're just misunderstanding science completely. You don't need all of this expensive equipment. You just need a repeatable method. You can do it the whole point of just doing it in my room. There's tons of ways you could mess that up. The reason I used that example was because it's easily to falsify that. I could just be cheating in infinitely many ways. Makes no difference. If the method works in my room or his room or her room, all across the world, if they all come up with the same result with all of the different conditions, then that's good evidence. You don't need a perfect little measuring device that costs $20,000 to do these experiments. Einstein's required a telescope and a direction, and that's it. That's all you need to test. There's lots of ways to get it wrong. Any one person could be seeing a delusion or misinterpreting the data, but all of the different people testing it all at once can't be. That's how you filter out those things. No matter how perfect your experiment is, it can always be wrong. There's no way to make a perfect experiment. It could always be user error or technological error. There's no way to make a perfect experiment. That's why it needs to be testable and repeatable. It's irrelevant how much money you spent on the detector. You just need a simple way to test it and repeat it, and that's it. That's all the science asked for. So this requirement that you have put forward, that you need this perfect experiment, nowhere in science is that required. No one cares about that. That's your own ridiculous criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I just completely disagree about the idea that you can take a sophisticated experiment that's being done using specific tools, specific protocols, and then recreate it in a cheap way, and that's going to amount to anything. So let's just go with what I'm saying. It's not that much money to get maybe China has photon detection units that are $2,000, and maybe a lot of different institutions could do it now and redo what Schwartz did. I follow this a lot because that's just one experiment. So Windbridge does experiments like this, Schwartz does experiments like this, and they're both in the same town. They actually replicate each other's experiments, right? But I would really like to see that experiment get replicated all around the world. I'd like to see it happening in Japan and Brazil and, different, West Coast, East Coast, USA, Canada. But that's not happening because there's really no fire to fire under their feet to want to do something like that to begin with, because it's not something that people take seriously. They look at that, they look at the data, they look at what Schwartz did, and they're like, yeah, that's impossible. So it's a struggle, and that's something that people in this area are familiar with. I would love to see if they replicated it, and if they did, and then no one had any results except Schwartz, then I'd be on your side, and I'd be like, well, now that's really fishy.
So again, this is always a burden of proof fallacy. You keep pushing the burden onto other scientists to check your work. You do it. I just Googled a photon detector. You can get one for $2,000 on eBay. $8,000 from.
I just said that. Right?
Well, yeah. So you could do it yourself. You don't need scientists to confirm this for you. You can do it. You can put it on YouTube. You can get all of your friends all over the world who agree with you to do it. And that would be a good way to start to motivate other people, if this works, to convince them to test it, like flat earthers did. Flat earthers said they have all these experiments that they can do to verify flat earth. And what happened was the real scientists came to them and said, okay, let's do these experiments together and show the work. And they posted documentaries about it on YouTube. It's got millions of views. This is really simple stuff. You don't need the scientists to confirm this for you. They're not the ones who need to do the repeatability. You are. You have the interest. You're right. They have no interest because they already know it's junk, because there's no confirming evidence. But
so that shows bias. You just demonstrated a lot of bias right there by saying, because they know it's junk. If you're supposed to be an objective scientist or a scientific minded person, you can't come onto a debate and say, we all know it's junk, but the proper attitude, shouldn't it be that, look, this is probably junk, but there is a lot of stuff to work through and figure out. So I just want to add that in there for the record. You made a very biased statement. Please continue.
No, I didn't add a biased statement at all. I literally explained how bias in the consensus is filtered out. So I proved to you that is not the case. There is no bias in the consensus. It's just the facts. And those facts, going off of those facts, isn't a bias. It's the rational thing to do. So it's not a bias to be rational, to say
it's not rational to say a whole genre of work is junk without basically being able to substantiate that. In this example, you haven't heard about the experiment I'm proposing yet. You looked up, you see there's a $2,000 unit. You actually made a great idea. I like your idea. I actually should do that and see if I can do some crowdfunder and get that $2,000 photon replication unit. I also need a team of mediums. I need, it's basically, it'll be a lot of work to replicate that. But at the end of the day, once I do that, it will be thrown out even if I get results, because we don't know what the conditions are. I'm just some Yahoo. I could be tinkering with it so that I get the results I want. I could be putting it on YouTube after I've basically made the whole thing up just to prove my point. And then those would be the arguments used against me. Much like if something gets published in the wrong article, people can say, well, I'm sorry, the wrong journal. People can say, well, this journal clearly has an agenda, so we have to throw it all out. So, it would be 10 times worse if me, some Yahoo decided I'm going to replicate Schwartz's work, because I could very easily be just tampering with it. Well, so it has to be done in an institution that is, we can confirm is not biased.
Remember, I already addressed that. So I already addressed that. I already said that your goal isn't to change the consensus on your own. The flat earthers did their own experiments, posted them on YouTube, and got scientists to actually go through it with them. That's what you need to do. You need to get interest in your idea by showing it works on YouTube, and then you will be able to build up more funding and more interest to be able to do it with more experts. Right now, there is zero of that. So expecting that the scientists who have real jobs and do real work to then be interested in this idea, which has no interest in it because it's never been demonstrated to work, is ridiculous. You need to do the experiments. You need to show that this works on YouTube, And then you can have other people demonstrate that and build interest, just like the flat earthers did. We know this works just fine. Flat earthers do it all the time, and other intelligent design people do it. This is a very successful method to gain interest, to garner interest in an idea. It's pretty easy to do the experiments yourself.
Look, let me say this. I like your idea. It would be great if putting something on YouTube somehow gets academics to say, let's go ahead and allocate funding to this. The problem with that is that, number one, it's YouTube. Okay, let's just forget about YouTube, but let's just be general and say it's the internet. Okay, I
literally gave you examples where this actually happens with the flat earthers.
I don't care about the flat earthers because that's a nothing burger. No one except people who have some kind of, I don't know, psychological disorder subscribe to flat earth. That's demonstrable that the earth is not flat, and it's really almost ridiculous that this subject could even be, compared by you to flat earth in some indirect way. I don't know what you're getting at there.
Here. Wait, let me see if I can explain this to you. So you're right. Flat earth is completely dumb and ridiculous, but even flat earthers got scientific funding to do experiments on a documentary and get their papers published because they garnered interest. So that's the reason I was using the flat earthers as an example, was because even something that crazy using this method that I just proposed can get funding. That was the point. So I wasn't comparing parapsychology to flat earth. I was saying that you could use the same method that those crazy people did to get funding.
Actually, look, what you're saying, I think it's a great idea. I think there should be more work from, hopefully not, somewhere in between a random Yahoo on YouTube and like an academic institution. So one example of that, crosses my mind, maybe like the Windbridge Institute. So it's like quasi-academic. You can't say it's actually tied to a university, but they also, they have a facility and they have researchers and they have credibility. So these are the types of places that kind of it falls upon to be able to publicize better what they're doing, to be able to put their work on YouTube, to be able to get people aware of, for example, that photon experiment, because this is actually, I know you're of the hardline position that all of it's not real or fake, and obviously I'm the opposite. But what we're looking at is you identifying the same issue that people on my camp have identified and think is a big problem, which is the lack of awareness and the lack of being able to get the information out there, to get more attention, to be able to get more research, because the status quo right now doesn't want anything to do with it. So maybe you have a point about getting things, for example, on the internet to a point where everyone's like, when we get a bunch of mediums together, we get a bunch of remote viewers together, we get a bunch of, psychics who can alter the health of plants. That's one of the experiments that I was researching concerning regenerating a plant health based upon the emotional frequency that's directed to the plant.
Yeah, that would be great. Like if you could just demonstrate that on YouTube and give us, like people like me, a method to test that would be great evidence, fantastic evidence. If we could have a way to revitalize plants, like I have dying plants in my backyard. If I can bring some psychics here to heal them and it works, that's great evidence. That's a testable prediction. That's predicting the future for sure.
And they were testing that in Japan, I believe. I'd have to go back through my notes, but that was I don't know what university it was in Japan that did that, but that was a big study that they did. And on that note, there are a lot of random yahoos on YouTube who have done those types of plant experiments, and then they've said, "Wow, look, now the plant's better." But look, I don't believe that stuff, and I'm on, the other camp from you are. When I see on YouTube someone said, look, I'm putting healing energy, to make my plant, grow again or become healthier. And then look what happened after 10 days. Or there was also the experiment with, I believe it was formation of water crystals using negative or positive emotions. And so the water crystals that were given hatred, they're all sharp. They have these jagged edges. And the water crystals given love are all like smooth and symmetrical, right?
By water crystals, do you mean ice?
Well, yeah, like forming, yeah, basically like when you begin to ice, water begins to crystallize. So that was like that was also an experiment. I think it was done in Japan, and I also am aware that people on YouTube have been doing that and saying, "Ooh, look, it works." But look, I'm on the other side of the aisle from you, and I look at that stuff. I'm like, I don't believe this because it's some dude on YouTube, and people want clicks, people want revenue,
Right,
and
right. I
so
totally agree. So the reason I want this is so that I can take 10 plants, have 5 of them I can try this on, and 5 of them I don't try this on to see if there is a disproportionate effect on the 5 I can try it on. So the point isn't because I'm going to believe the YouTube video, obviously not. The point is to find a method to see how it works, and then so I can test it in my home or get whatever is required to test it here, and I can do the experiment. That's the goal. The goal isn't for me to be convinced by YouTube videos. The goal is for me to have a method that I can repeat and test to see if it works.
and I think another variable that makes that a little bit difficult is we're not sure if you or me directing energy to a plant is going to vitalize the plant. Maybe it takes somebody with a quote psychic ability, or somebody who has that who has claims to have that ability or has demonstrated that they have that ability. So for example, if
Sure, absolutely, but
we'll go with the photon experiment, for example, with Schwartz. I'm not a medium, right? So I could set all that up and put it into a dark room, and then I could be, it's like I'm going to channel a spirit and have them come at 10:46 p.m. and then I'm going to check the graphs. And that's another part of that experiment is actually the computer processing, the equipment they need to measure the photons. That's super expensive too. But let's say I had all that. Probably it's not going to do anything. I would have to then go through a testing process. So like the medium Schwartz uses, he's run them through, double, triple blind conditions for years, studying them and going through many, many mediums who he discounted as not being legitimate until he basically narrowed that down to like the cream of the crop. Of what he felt with the mediums who actually had a talented ability, and then he used those mediums for those experiments. So now we're in a really difficult area. If it's like, okay, if there's only if you get 100 mediums and only 5% are not cold readers, or not hot readers, or not, they're not charlatans, or they're not people self-deluded. And you have that core who actually have this ability, and then you're using them, you're getting those amazing results. How would we be able to replicate that without going through a long process of finding those same mediums?
Well, that would be, again, you need to provide the methodology. So you would need to say, to become a medium, you do these things, go through this course or whatever, and then you'll be able to do this method to have that effect. So the whole point is that you need to tell me these things. Like when you say that we don't know what kind of person can give energy to the plant or whatever, that's something that you need to tell me. That's a part of the method that you need to give to demonstrate this works. If it's just random chance and some people can do it and some people can't, that's no different than random chance, and you can't differentiate, is it real or is it imaginary? So the whole point is that you need to give me this method. You need to tell me what the steps are that I need to take so I can repeat this experiment or get the correct people who can, so that I can test it. So it's up to you to tell me those things.
Well, I would say it's up to the people who are facilitating these in the first place. So
Right.
I agree. I think that for example, somebody like Schwartz, they should have a YouTube channel. They should be saying, these are the steps, and this is how any other institution can try it out. Please post your results. And again, there's a lot of problems with that, because you're going to have someone's like, ooh, I want attention. I'm just going to pull some results out of my butt and put some info up. But like you said, if there's many different areas, people in different parts of the world are doing the same thing and they're having the same results, then that would theoretically generate attention. And then that would also theoretically get mainstream academia involved to maybe put some funding behind it. Now, the flat earth thing, I think that was funded because almost like it was a publicity stunt. Like, isn't it so funny that, our college was able to finally, hand it to these flat earthers, because the flat earthers are really annoying, and they,
but remember, remember that is the point of science. So the whole point of science is to prove everybody else wrong. So they're always going to be that way. The whole point, that's exactly what you want. You want scientists to come make a joke out of you, say, well, we're going to debunk you, and then fail. Because if they fail, you get famous. Like I said, the way you get famous in science is by proving your colleagues wrong. So if that happens, that's exactly what you want to happen.
Yeah. So ultimately, what we're looking at is, I think I definitely agree that there's a lot more that people who are involved in the nuts and bolts science, or the science experiments, I should say, involving psi or mediumship and a lot of these subjects. There's a lot more that they could be doing. I think there's a lot of hurdles involved. Like that was one I just gave. Like how long do you have to filter through psychics or filter through mediums until you find one who actually has ability that you can work with? And that alone, I think, is going to make it a difficult experiment to replicate on like an amateur level, right? Because that takes a long time, it takes a lot of effort, and it seems like there isn't quite the fire to do that when the feeling is that, I'm going to put all this effort into this, but still no one's going to take it seriously because it's quote paranormal. So I'm still not going to get, freaking, Stanford University on board with it. So I think that there's challenges involved with that. And so maybe my greater point is that there are many challenges in this area. So when I approach these supernatural topics as basically a journalist, I see a lot of wild experiments. I see a lot of crazy results. I see a lot of, I think, credible testimonials. I can look at a phenomenon as a whole. I can read, books about near-death experiences. I can look at Kenneth Ring and Sabam and Morris, or even the Aware study, which was like inconclusive and interesting, and I think pushed the near-death experience area forward in terms of life after death.
Have they published the second one yet?
No, there's the second one is still underway. The first one, it's we could obviously have a whole show talking about the Aware study, but that's another example. Very, very tricky, because the idea was, well, we'll put numbers on the wall, because when someone's out of their body, maybe they'll see the numbers. But of course, there's many logical issues with that. For example, is someone out of their body, and are they facing the numbers? Do they have the same sensory ability that we have to be able to process numbers? What if their equivalent of the left brain that interprets things doesn't work when you're in the out of body state? For example, when you're having a dream, you try to read a newspaper or something, right? And it's all jumbled up because like the left lobe of the brain that has the logical processing of information isn't working so well. Would somebody necessarily be able to understand the numbers? So there was a lot of issues surrounding that. And so, they didn't, so as I predicted when Aware was, underway, they didn't find anyone who was able to accurately say 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 15, 12, whatever. But they did get at least one guy who was able to verify different procedures being done to him, things that the nurses were saying, stuff like that, which is also in the literature of near-death experiences, people able to verify information that's from the operating room. There was the famous red shoe incident. I mean, that was Pam Reynolds, who, but again, you would just say it's anecdote, so there's really no point in mentioning it.
I've gone through a number of those, like the Craig Keener miracles have some of the better examples, but the explanation for near-death experiences like those is pretty simple. Is that when your brain shuts down unexpectedly, it's kind of like having a bunch of water tubes just shut down randomly. All of the tubes are still open in the way they were before. And so all of your experiences that are still going on, because there's still activity in your body, there's still biochemical activity going on, even if there's no like EEG information. So all of the things that are still happening to your body are still recorded in your brain as conscious memories. So like if you get touched on the arm or someone says a word, those vibrations still vibrate your eardrum, and those vibrations get turned into words, which get turned into memories, which when you wake up are then recalled as conscious memories. So that's when someone who has an NDE recalls what happens to them in an operating room, or what someone said in a hallway, or other things that happened to them physically at the time period. It's because their brain is still working, even though it doesn't have any major electrical activity going on, because all of their neurons and biochemical activity in their body is still going on, and it's just saved as a conscious memory.
And what I'll say is that I understand it would be irresponsible of scientists to not propose that. It would be irresponsible of Parnia, for example, who ran Aware, to not explore something like that, because that is, like you said, this is how science operates, to disprove things. And you have to get through a gauntlet of things being disproven. Now, in regard to that, there's many questions that surround the NDE where that particular explanation starts to get questionable. For example, the rapid expansion of consciousness, not the reduction of consciousness. So when you have hypoxia, when oxygen is not coming into the brain, what happens is that your consciousness, it shrinks, it doesn't expand. So then being presented with that.
What do you mean by expansion here?
So expansion, well, basically, how do we measure this short of being able to ask people who are in that state what they experienced? So in the near-death experience, there is virtually there wouldn't be considered near-death experience if it was like my awareness was shrinking, my perceptions were shrinking, I felt like I was stuck in a bunch of mud, everything was disjointed, black. This is what would technically happen given those circumstances. But with near-death experiences, what happens is what's reported, which I know you could say is anecdotal, but when this happens again and again and again to an entire percentage of the world population, it's something to think about.
Sorry,
we're discussing
quickly, mate.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? While we're on this subject, I just want to pose it to the audience and to yourselves. I suggest it might be useful on this area subject if we kind of ignore the 1 hour timer for now and spend a little bit more time on this subject, because it is important to the debate before we go on to Q&A. Maybe another 15 minutes.
I will retort also and say that yes, we should, but within reason, because if we extend too long, I might not be able to stay here.
Okay,
sure. So I'll talk about.
Pick up on that point anyway. So
okay, well let's
if it's okay,
just continue on.
If it's okay, I'll finish what I was saying and then I'll transfer it to you. So basically, with near-death experiences, what the report tends to be, my consciousness was expanded. It was everywhere. I could see 360-degree vision around, the operating room. I soared above the hospital. Then, I saw the light, the tunnel, and then I had an experience with a higher being. I could, sense and feel the emotions of the planet and all. It goes into all kinds of crazy directions. I went to another world, and there was a beautiful garden. Like, it goes on and on. But the main the crux of the NDE is a massive expansion of consciousness. Like NDEers I speak to, they have a difficult time coping back in this reality again, because their consciousness was so expanded when they had that experience that they describe it to me like they've had to filter their existence back down to like a tiny bubble of what they experienced when they were in the operating room, when they had cardiac arrest, and their brain was should have been shutting down. So that is one of the mysteries of the NDE. But anyway, I'll take it back to you.
Yeah, I don't think that's much of a mystery. We know exactly why that happens. Like when someone loses one sense, their other senses compensate. So when you essentially go unconscious, you've lost all of your senses, and so your brain is compensating by making all of them purely just fictionalized in the head. Because when you imagine a sense experience like pain, the part of your brain that lights up is the exact same part of the brain that actually feels the pain. So when you lose your sense experience because you're unconscious, your brain can compensate for that by making all of them seem significantly more vivid, because they're controlled purely by the brain and not limited by the actual sense experience, which makes sense why it would be far more expansive, because if you're not actually limited by the physical touch you're having, well, then you can experience significantly more physical touch. And this is the same experience we have on MDMA and acid and all kinds of drugs. We experience the exact same thing because the chemical interactions in the brain, we understand how those can produce those kinds of interactions. The reason they're limited when we're alive is purely for functional reasons. Like we don't want to have a significant experience of pain to pass out when we're like get poked with a needle or whatever. And so our body limits the amount of sensory information we have while conscious, because it's proportional to the things we're experiencing in the world. Whereas when we're unconscious, those limits are significantly reduced. So all of that makes perfect sense under a naturalistic hypothesis of things we have already discovered about the brain.
So here's what I will say is that I would buy into what you're saying if the NDEs were described in such a way as they were missing a sensation and then things were compensated. For example, I couldn't see anything, but I could hear all around the hospital room, or I couldn't hear anything in the hospital room, but it felt like I could see everything from every direction. So that's not what we hear when we study NDEs. We hear all five senses being enhanced to a very strange level from what it should be at. And this also occurs, for example, with Pam Reynolds, when there was verifiably no active brain calculations happening, right? So I believe that she was under an advanced form of, I guess we could say, anesthesia, but that is, I think that's a bit of an understatement. I believe they had her brain literally frozen and there was no electrical activity, almost no electrical activity. And then they kind of brought her back to life. It's still an amazing procedure what they did to her. But regardless, she had one of the most intense, vivid NDEs that has been documented, as well as being able to verify a detail of something that happened that was not in the hospital. In this case, I believe that was the red shoe incident when she claimed that she went above the hospital and found it like a Nike. For some reason, somebody left it on the roof of the hospital, and who knows how it got there. And then the nurses and doctors went up to investigate to see if it was there, and it was there. So that's a famous story. Again, right. That's not scientific evidence because it's a story that happened that someone talked about. But from a journalistic point of view, you compile those things and you see it happening again and again and again and again. And then the question becomes, how do we interpret reality? Because we can interpret reality strictly through, if it's not in a test tube, it's not real. And here's the thing is, I understand that. Okay. I understand that it's difficult.
Well, I did kind of want to respond to those 2 points real quick.
Sorry, go on.
So one, the red shoe example is really easy to explain. Many of the examples of NDEs is when someone nearby is talking, what they're talking about is remembered in the brain. So someone just could have mentioned the red shoe, like a janitor who was walking past, and that could have easily explained it. Secondly, when I was talking about the losing the senses, it's not like if you are in the dream and didn't have vision, then your hearing in the dream would have increased. It's literally the physical sensations are gone because that part of your brain isn't connected anymore. Therefore, the sensations that you're imagining in the brain are going to be amplified because they're not limited by the physical sensations themselves. That was the argument. So it's not literally like you lose your hearing in the dream and then gain supervision in the dream. It would be just because you're not gaining the full spectrum of physical sensations that you normally would, the response in the brain isn't going to be limited by those. So that's why it would be an increase.
Okay. So the issue with that is what happens when your brain is shutting down, experiencing hypoxia. So when there's lack of oxygen to the brain, this is not characterized unless, look, I could be wrong. Maybe we could ask somebody involved in medicine in that field, but hypoxia from what I've studied creates a limitation of senses. So even if you're losing your sense of sight, that doesn't mean that suddenly your hearing is going to become really powerful. Because your brain is losing oxygen basically, so it doesn't have access to the same abilities that it would have normally. Like in this world, we could go into in a healthy environment, we could go into a sensory deprivation environment, or we could purposefully block one sense, or we could take a drug that nullifies one sense and then it increases the sensory perception of other sensory faculties. So what we're seeing is people undergoing oxygen deprivation who shouldn't have access to senses like they would normally. They shouldn't even have heightened senses because they don't, their brain is basically getting scrambled up. So this idea that they can have an expanded sense of consciousness when they're flatlined on a table, or their brain just is barely producing an electrical function at all, like with Pam Reynolds' case, it's very, very difficult to explain that away so quickly. And also think about the janitor. I mean, what are the odds of that? That it just so happens that a janitor is talking about a red shoe, and then she puts those pieces together, and then she has her near-death experience, and Look, I mean, one way or the other, that is an anecdote. I mean, it was verified from the nurses and doctors. And that's, also why we're coming from different planets, because I look at journalistic reports of things like this that happen and take them seriously. But, you are more of the test tube, shut up and calculate, and let's do the experiment mindset. And that's the oil and water situation in most of these types of debates between skeptic and proponent, right? Is that there's almost like different mindsets of being able to interpret reality. But maybe I'm going off point. The point was about hypoxia. I'll bring it back to you.
Well, yeah. I did want to mention that. So I think you misunderstood my analogy here. So the analogy isn't that you actually have, because there's a difference between your actual physical senses and your imagination of your senses. Like when you imagine you're feeling pain, that part of your brain that literally feels the physical pain that lights up. You got the somasensory and somasomatic cortex, and when you get touched, those light up in your brain. And if you are paraplegic, the same areas light up in the brain, even if you can't feel anything in your arm when you're imagining it. So there's two separate things there. There's the physical sensation and then how it's interpreted by the brain. If you turn off the physical sensation, like if you're on drugs, acid or MDMA, then what happens is those parts of the brain become hypersensitive. So they become more sensitive because they're no longer limited by the physical sensation. So it's kind of like removing the shackles so they can become more sensitive. So if you do have a near-death experience, it's because those shackles are removed, just like with acid, it makes sense that it would be more sensitive, because the reason it's not sensitive is because it is tied directly to the physical sensation. And if you get rid of the physical sensation, it amplifies it with the drugs and with things like, forget what it's called, the where you lose a limb and you can still feel it. The
Phantom limb syndrome.
Yes, that's it. V.S. Ramachandran. So it actually makes sense under current neurology to say that you would actually gain levels of consciousness if you are no longer tied to your physical sensations, such as in the case of taking drugs or hypoxia or losing brain function suddenly, unexpectedly.
But we don't know that. We would have to look at the actual studies about brain sensitization during hypoxia, during cardiac arrest, or during examples like Pam Reynolds, when there's virtually no electrical activity in the brain. So the question becomes is how is that still happening, and how is all that coming together for this perfect storm of the near-death experience that is also consistent in all cultures about, they meet deceased loved ones, they leave their bodies, they go to other worlds, they have expanded awareness of all five senses, mind you, not just one or two senses. And let me tell you something. My whole interest in this area would have probably grinded to a screeching halt if near-death experiences were as you are saying they could be or should be or would make sense if they were. For example, if near-death experiences were this kind of mishmash of, I was lying on the operating room bed and I couldn't see anything, but I could hear everybody around me. I had this sense of peace. If that was what NDEs were, I would have discounted NDEs a long time ago. I'm not saying that I would have been like a dyed-in-the-wool supernatural skeptic, but at least I got started researching NDEs, and I wouldn't have wanted to waste my time with them because it's almost clearly evident that just something happening in the brain if they were described the way that you're saying that they should be described as. But the way NDEs are reported throughout cultures, and millions and millions of these have very key elements which don't add up to what you're describing as brain hypersensitivity, because we're looking at, again, five senses being highly amplified, but we're also looking at coherent experiences in what are described as outside the body states. And also, this is just something I'll throw out there. I believe it was 98% of near-death experiences when they encounter a deceased loved one, it is somebody who is dead. If these were brain-based hallucinations, it would be like when I'm dreaming. A dream is a hallucination. I'm seeing freaking living people and dead people and dogs and cats and ponies. Near-death experiences are consistently encounters with deceased people, not people who are, again, living, or Santa Claus or fictitious creatures, or heck, when I'm having hallucinations, if I'm sleeping and dreaming, then I'm seeing characters from TV shows. Now, there's a very, very, very small amount of NDEs, which I think are hallucinations, when it's like I was lying on the operating table and then Santa Claus came up to me to give me presents. But that's such a small, tiniest fraction of NDEs. I have yet to hear a sufficient explanation about why NDEers only consistently meet deceased people. But anyway, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, they don't, because even in the Sam Parnia examples that he uses, there's examples of a lady who had an NDE and then saw her family at home and knew what they were eating for dinner as one of their examples. They do see live people in NDE.
But that was in the context of her family being alive, non-deceased. So it was a journey to visit them here on the earthly plane of consciousness, as a spirit. But when it comes to actually interacting, so like they're going toward the light, and then the figures come out, and it's always grandma, it's always uncle who passed away, it's always the pet dog who died. I was just reading a Jen Price's NDE when she met her deceased dog. It's never I'm going toward the tunnel in the light, and then the freaking character from my favorite character from Firefly comes out. Nathan Fillion comes out, and he's ready to meet me, and then they take me to to the TV show. It's like there's never anything like that.
We have examples of that too. So we have examples of kids who have NDEs and they meet Santa Claus when going to the big light.
But this is interesting about that, because that's exclusively to children. And the afterlife related hypothesis was that this entity people meet, it seems to, for adults, take the form of a light or something that we can relate to. And it also seems to dumb itself down to appeal to kids.
Yeah. So doesn't that imply that it has to do with the psychology of the person, what they've learned in their culture and their background association? So like if you see if you see a sleigh, a red sleigh, then your brain is going to interpret, oh, Santa Claus, and you'll fill in the blanks from there. So it makes sense that if you see a light, and in a culture that believes in a god, you're going to associate that with death and souls of the loved ones and a god. So just like a kid's going to associate the light with Santa Claus, parents are going to associate it with their preferred imaginary friends. For religious people, like Hindus have near-death experiences of Vishnu, and Christians have near-death experiences of Jesus, and Muslims have near-death experiences of Muhammad. It seems that has more to do with psychological priming of what they've learned in the past, and those parts of their brain are being lit up. But I wanted to go back to, again, when I'm talking about the senses, I'm saying that they still have all five senses, and all five of the senses are going to be magnified, because each of the five senses are limited by their physical correlates. So if you get rid of the physical limitation, like the sense of touch, then the sense of touch is going to be magnified. If you get rid of the sense of hearing is going to be magnified. If you get rid of the sense of sight is going to be magnified. So if you get rid of the physical causes of all of those, they're all going to be magnified, which is literally, because we do know that happens during hypoxia, because that's one of the causes of death when you take too much of certain drugs, because it stops the ability of the blood to be able to transfer oxygen as efficiently, which then causes hypoxia, which is one of the causes of death of taking certain kinds of drugs, which is one of the reasons they're so effective and deadly. So we do know that the magnified sense of consciousness is a result of drugs specifically due to hypoxia.
How can there be sight if you're having cardiac arrest and your eyes are closed? I mean, I referenced at the beginning of the debate the book called Mind Sight that relates specifically, for example, to blind people who have had a sight experiences during their NDEs. Sorry?
Have you heard of blind sight?
Possibly. Go on.
So blind sight is a field in neurology where you have a specific part of the brain is damaged, where the eye is connected to in two separate ways. That's two separate pathways. One goes to more the conscious side, one goes to the subconscious in the visual cortex. And if the connection to your conscious is damaged, but the connection to your subconscious isn't damaged, people who are completely blind and can see nothing can still identify color just by holding up a card, because it's connected to their subconscious.
Yes, but that's by holding up a card, not in a situation when when they're literally under cardiac arrest, and there is, first of all, there's no signal going to the eyes, and their eyes are closed. Or like in Pam Reynolds' case, she actually her whole face was bolstered shut by, I think it was cloth.
Yes, I'm getting there. So just like there's blind sight where you have one sense damaged, you can have complete sight with all of the senses damaged. So if you have an electrode shocked in the brain, you can generate the sense of sight purely by the visual cortex with absolutely no photon connection to your eyes whatsoever. You literally have no eyeballs. You can still see things if you just excite the correct parts of the brain. So if you're under hypoxia or under a drug hallucination of some kind with no eyeballs, you can still see things if you light up the correct parts of the brain. So even though all of the sense experience was gone, the brain generates a virtual idea of the world in your head and lights up those areas just fine. Without any sense experience at all. So what
do you mean it creates a virtual representation of the world? I mean, obviously I need to look into that literature to see what you're talking about, because that's very, very interesting. That this would mean that somebody who is blind from birth, if they got the brain stimulated, then they could create an entire virtual space and have perfect sight again from stimulating the brain without any action happening through the cornea, through the retina, without any signal coming in through the eyes, and then be able to see the world around them. That I'm very suspicious of that being able to operate the way it's described from people who have seen during NDEs. But that's very interesting that without any ability of the eye, that you could see the entire world around you. With near-death experiences, what we're looking at is not only does the sight come back in these out-of-body states, but then you have all the other elements of the near-death experience. And then again, like the point I mentioned before, you got people coming through the light who are deceased loved ones. You have, your deceased dog. You have the encounter with the entity. And you mentioned that before about, the psychological component of that, which I agree with. But I always like these NDEs where the light of the entity says, basically, reveals itself to be taking the form of whatever it's most comfortable with. So Jesus appears and then is ultimately like, I am beyond Jesus. And then Jesus becomes something else and, shapeshifts around. I've read a few NDEs like that. And, from the afterlife perspective that I come from, I see that as there's an entity or there is something that's a higher part of yourself that is kind of shape-shifting into whatever it is that you are expecting to want, what you want it to be. That's one of the reasons, I don't take too seriously when I hear NDEs talking about, for example, Jesus or Krishna. I think that, this is whatever whatever entity, maybe it's something part of your higher self. I don't know what it is, but it's like taking different guises to so that the individual unit of consciousness doesn't freak out, more or less. So that's kind of the way I see it. But again, we're kind of in metaphysical territory, right? So metaphysical territory is for speculating about reality. You have your view, I have my view. I think with the being able to have full cognitive visual awareness with your eyes taped shut because of a stimulation of the brain, I strongly suspect it's not quite like you're describing it to me, but I have to research that.
Yeah, I think we've actually done tons and tons of research on that, specifically on many people who we've given sight who literally just don't have eyes by stimulating. I think that was actually one of the experiments where a guy does not have an eye. And what they do is they create a box in the visual cortex and they can light up areas to create like outlines of things. I think that's one of the experiments. But yeah, you mentioned the seeing dead loved ones. I mean, that's a condition we already know about. What's it called? Bereavement delusion. Bereavement delusions where 15% of people see dead loved ones all the time.
But we're not doing this. Is not 15%. This is almost this like 97% of near-death experiences when they encounter somebody who in another human being. It's the
well, I'm talking about people who are conscious, fully awake, fully conscious. If you're just a regular awake person, you will see a dead loved one. 15% of people.
Yeah, but this is not people in bereavement though. These are people who they hadn't thought about grandma in 15 years. Then they see grandma, or even in the cases that I put up earlier at the beginning of the debate, people seeing deceased loved ones that they didn't even know were dead until they were able to look them up later. It's like, oh, that was Aunt that was Aunt Sheila, who I never met. So there's a lot of cases like that as well. But that argument falls apart because these aren't necessarily people under bereavement or under grief.
Well, the point here was just to say that priming is already in the brain. Like, we know that a significant amount of people see dead loved ones all the time, so that's not really a particularly special occurrence. That was the only point there.
I think it's a stretch to connect 15% of people, and I have to again look at those stats, who say that they see deceased loved ones, which is under the context of bereavement, to people who may or may not be experiencing any kind of bereavement, experiencing deceased loved ones who sometimes they don't even know had died to begin with. So I don't buy that, but that's fine.
I would like, if possible, just to jump in there because I think it's a very interesting point that I was going to ask as well as a question to Tom in the Q&A is that. What's your take on those experiences where the near-death experiencer sees people who are dead, who tell them that they're dead, that they weren't aware had passed on, and apparently nobody had? I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Darren, I'm sorry. Who are you asking? And
he was asking me. So he asked me what was my take on where people who see NDEs of people who are dead and they're tell them they're dead, but they didn't know they were dead at the time.
Yes.
And my answer would be is like, if I saw a dream of my grandma and she said she was dead, I mean, because she's how old she is, that's fairly probable. So if it was just a random person aged 16 or whatever, that could occur at a regular interval. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. But if it's just a grandmother who's probably getting old and you're probably thinking she's probably going to die anyway because of her age, then it would just make sense logically that your brain would come to that conclusion. So I'd have to look at the cases, but it's probably the case that most of them are just pretty generally reasonable to assume that you were already going to conclude they were dead just from induction because they're old or whatever.
Just to add, I think some of the most well-known cases include those who are young, who had car crashes and things like that while they were at college or wherever. That's kind of the ones that stand out. So what would you think about that sort of thing? I know I probably
there's lots of different things. The easiest one is they actually just read about it in a newspaper, and so they already knew and just didn't remember.
Darren, do you think we should do like closing statements and then go into questions? I'm only asking because I know it's been past the hour. I'm feeling a little bit COVID-y, so I might want to. I think I need to take a walk soon.
Yeah, I'm ready to go to Q&A. I don't need a closing.
I think Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay, not a problem. I see that in the chat it's mainly kind of Cyrus's audience that came over, so the majority of questions are for Tom.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Tom. I don't mean to sick my audience on you.
That's all right.
So, Cyrus, in fact, no, we'll start with Tom's because we'll go through yours first. There's more of them. KC Temps 19 asks, why can't we question the way materialistic... Let me just check my mic's on. Yes, it is. I did that last time. Why can't we question the way materialistic science determines what is valid evidence? Science has been proven to be wrong. In fact, the whole point of science is to try and understand everything.
Yes, you can question it as much as you want. All you need to do is provide a reliable method to differentiate imagination from reality, and you win. That's all science requires. So anybody can do that. Anybody can provide whatever method you want, and if we can confirm it, you win, and you're free to do that. No one in science says you can't challenge it. Everyone says go ahead and challenge it. Just provide us a way to differentiate imagination from reality, and we'll test it.
Let me just, if I may just add something real quick. And what we're seeing here is I'm questioning it, and there's a prosecutorial argument, I guess. So actually, we could intermix it. Maybe I'm the prosecutor. Maybe Tom's the attorney. I don't really know. But what we're looking at, this is how basically things flesh out, right? So things can be argued, things can be challenged, and then there can be an opposing team basically expressing how, rebutting those ideas. And that goes back and forth. And it happens on the academic level, of course, to an extreme degree. When you look at journals, scientific journals, it's brutal. If somebody has an idea for a new medicine, then, you'll get 70 doctors basically, pushing that idea down into the dirt. And it is the brutal way that ideas come to fruition. And just in my opinion, this is an idea that is coming into fruition and eventually will be. And Tom is opposing that, which we could actually argue is the way it's supposed to be. Even though we're not scientists, we're just, maybe you are, Tom. I don't know your background, but we're just debating the issue. But it's in the same process of that. But I'm sorry, go on.
Brilliant. So not for us, with a number 4 in it, very clever, asks Tom, how do we measure, and you've got quotation marks, impact on the world? Only by what makes money? Generally, only what makes money in the capitalist system is funded by science. Right, so I think what he means is, why is it that science only seems to be focused on studying areas that are known to be profitable? I suppose.
Well, no. So impact on the world, when I said that, is just novel testable predictions. So if you can make a prediction like the healing trees example that Cyrus used earlier, that would be great. That's an impact on the world. Impact on the world just means some kind of empirically demonstrable effect. It doesn't mean money. Like the guy who invented electricity, he brought it before the Queen, and the Queen asked him, well, what good is this? And he said, I have no idea what this is used for, but I know in the future we'll be able to tax it. And that was his justification. So it just any empirically demonstrable effect that can be repeatable is an effect on the world. It doesn't need to be profound.
Cyrus, anything you'd like to add?
I'm sorry?
Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would say that in this field, a lot of the effects it has on the world, unfortunately, we're dealing with the subject of the study of multi-dimensions. That's what it is. Not an afterlife. I don't think there is an afterlife. I think it was just life. There's a multi-dimensional component. That's my position. And of course, I can go into tangent talk about many respected scientists who agree with that, and even going, because this stuff links up with multiverse theory. But the point is that in the study of multi-dimensions, it's difficult sometimes to pinpoint a practical application. But like I mentioned with the trees, which I don't know one way or the other, it actually requires what we discussed. It needs to be people basically copying those experiments, which again, I think were out of Japan, and testing them all the time. I just don't see that happening. But it's possible that some of those kind of niche areas when it comes to like a non-material phenomena could be practical and could have that effect. And, maybe there's like let's say hypothetically that there's a process where you have to be certified to be a psychic or to have a psychic ability. And let's say 95% of people who think they're psychics are charlatans or self-deluded. And you have that 5%, and then they're certified. And then you can hire them to come to your house and heal your plants. And then there's a demonstrable effect. Do we know if that's possible or not? No one knows, because we're light years away from, the conditions to allow something like that to happen. But that's kind of the only way to get the practical element of this that's going to immediately help society. So that's another reason it's difficult to get the funding behind the idea of multi-dimensions, the multiverse, and other realities and things like that. Because it's like, how do we turn that into a microchip? How do we immediately use that? But of course, there's greater benefits on a psychological level, which could lead to even greater things in the future. It's just that's part of the challenge. That's part of what's blocking this subject, from advancing much since the 1900s. Arguably the heyday was in the 1920s, and now it's 2020. Anyway, go on.
Okay, Cyrus, given the fact that Gary Schwartz has published his article outlining the methodology, why has it not been taken and replicated as of yet?
Are you asking me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, let's see. It's published in Explorer, and I was asking Mark Pitstick about this, who works with Schwartz. His answer was it's being replicated as we speak in numerous universities. And so I am... this may have been related to one of their other projects, or maybe just a collective of different things that Schwartz has done. And so I need to actually bug him and see if I can get some data about that. Now, as for why things are not generally replicated, I actually think it comes back to what, earlier in the debate with Tom, when we were discussing basically almost like the lack of high profile reasons for people to investigate. For example, flat Earth is so ridiculous that even that got a certain level of academic attention because it's all over the internet, and they wanted to high five each other to prove them wrong. But in this situation, there's not like publicity. People don't know about these things, and it's not on the radar. And it's the job, I think, of people in parapsychology to get on the radar more effectively. So Schwartz does great work, and he's a really cool guy. But maybe he should hire a publicity department, for crying out loud. I don't know. So
yeah, and it certainly seems that there is a lot of this stuff coming into the mainstream, especially with the likes of the new Netflix series that a lot of people are supportive of and critical of.
I'm sorry, what's that?
It seems that this sort of area is coming into the public light with the new Netflix series Surviving Death, which talks about...
Oh yeah. I mean that's generating interest, at least for episodes 1 and 6. I don't know about the in between episodes, maybe doing the opposite effect, but just in my group had a giant influx of people joining as a result of that series. But yeah,
certainly. I mean, I've seen a few of the episodes. Episodes 2 and 3 are terrible when it comes to evidential value.
Well, I mean, it's almost like, yeah, they're almost kind of setting it up to fail a bit, because there's really legit, like I was discussing, even with, they could have gone to Schwartz's lab, looked at double-blind, triple-blind experiments, looked at the protocols, looked at the results. You don't necessarily want to jump into seances, and things like that when we're in the phase of hashing the ideas out. So I don't even want to watch those episodes 2 and 3, because just the idea of that kind of makes me angry. But go on.
Yeah, I mean, if you're after proper evidential value of life after death, that's not the episodes to watch, certainly. Okay, Tom. So according to Tom, I didn't note down who wrote this. So according to Tom, quantum physics is not real, right? I don't know what the relevance is there, but
Quantum physics is definitely real.
I don't think Tom would say that. I'll interrupt, and I don't mean to speak on behalf, but Tom would definitely not say quantum physics is not real. I think maybe the question is saying some of the more surprising elements of quantum physics call certain levels of materialism into question, which when we go into the spooky action at distance and certain elements of quantum entanglement, which are basically I think because those are demonstrable and they affect reality, they actually used to be met with like almost the same level of ridicule that some of the Paris stuff is met with today. But of course, now we're making computers that use quantum entanglement and spooky action successfully. So now we have the same issue we talked about, demonstrable effects creating money and products we can use. And so now it is, totally accepted, but it's going to be spun into the rather force fit through the prism of materialism, if you will. I don't mean to hijack the question.
Well, yeah. In quantum mechanics, we've already known since the beginning of quantum mechanics, quantum information is a kind of physical information.
Okay, very well. I suppose the main controversy of quantum physics is the likes of the Copenhagen interpretation and that consciousness collapses the wave function. There's a lot of controversy around that. So...
Oh, yeah, sure. But those are all physical information-based theories. So none of those are non-physical.
And if I can add... What we're going to see, Darren, is we're going to see the definitions of physical and material keep getting stretched and stretched and stretched until finally someday we'll be looking at, the afterlife is just a material thing. I mean, it's just, we all know that consciousness is a material product, and then other dimensions and universes are also material products. So yeah. I just think that's just me speculating a little bit, but it is funny how much it's already stretched concerning what you just referenced.
Yes, and I would agree and add that if there is an afterlife or some form of existence post physical death, I would say it's just an undiscovered part of nature. I wouldn't say it's any religious based thing. It's just a part of nature that we haven't discovered yet. What the nature of that is, of course, we don't know.
Well, right, I actually would kind of agree with you on that, but it's the reason the physical keeps getting stretched is because the theories are this is a physical thing. And if it's a physical thing, I make this prediction is confirmed, therefore it's physical. If you ever made the prediction, this is a non-physical thing, here's a prediction to confirm, then that would be evidence of the non-physical. But no one's ever done that. That's why
I'm happy to say that there is no such thing as non-physical. I'm also happy to say there's really almost no such thing as physical. It's like where we see is the reality operating in ways that we observe it operating. And then the deeper we go, the more of those rules that we think are so strong and solid begin to break down. So the question becomes, what is physical? What is non-physical? And often something I disagree with in the new agey field is they put this dualism, like this is physical stuff, this stuff is non-physical stuff. I have out-of-body experiences where I'm completely lucid in a parallel environment, sometimes obtaining verifiable information with third parties who I can verify as being actual people in that state by even doing things like Google searches, like, hey, you used to be alive on Earth, what's your name? Then I Google search them. That's an anecdote. It adds nothing to the argument. But the point is, in those environments, I'm as physical and solid as anything. I can punch a wall and feel pain in my knuckles. And I've often hypothesized that it's, being in that parallel frequency is still a physical environment. And I may very well be in that parallel frequency with a brain in my skull that's being used to interpret that environment. So to me, it's almost like, the brain debate takes on a whole different context with me, because the brain could be existing on whole other parallel frequencies, and those parallel frequencies could also be physical. But I know I'm going on a tangent, so I'll take it back to you. And I might need to go kind of soon, just a heads up, because I really need to take a walk or something.
Not a problem. Okay, just quickly, is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Tom?
No, I'm good. We can go to the next one.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, for Tom, talking about biases, it's not about individual bias, but collective or institutional bias. How does Tom guarantee there is none in full caps?
Because again, the way you get famous in science is by proving everybody else wrong. So the way you filter out biases is that everyone is wrong except me. And that's the bias everybody has. And so if you present an idea, the standard is everyone already has the bias. That's wrong. They treat every idea as wrong. So if they treat every idea as equally wrong, then there isn't a bias against some ideas and not against other ideas. They think everything is wrong. They want to prove it wrong from the offset. So it doesn't matter how bad your bias is against it, because they already hate it. They already want to prove it wrong. It doesn't matter what the idea is. Everybody rejected Einstein's theory for the same reason. It's wrong. We want it to be wrong. We want our theory to be right. And so if everyone already has a bias that it's wrong and it's always going to be wrong and we hate it, then there can't be a bias against it because it's against everything. So there's no disproportionate bias against any one position. And the whole point of testable predictions is that it overcomes the bias. If we can't prove it wrong because we all think it's wrong, well, then that means that your bias loses to that whatever method it is. So that's how we filter out the bias, because there's a bias for everything. Everything is wrong except my idea.
And I guess I'll add my 2 cents. I don't think some people in the metaphysical community understand how brutal academia and science is. Everything is wrong, and that is the standard. And I guess you could say that is the quote bias. So when people see that the bias toward the supernatural subjects, what they're seeing is because some people maybe don't have a background as well in reading journals and they know how the scientific process works. They're being introduced to the first time to the brutal nature of everything is wrong except me, right? And so so when non-physical, again, I want to use the term non-physical, when supernatural or some of these ideas come to the surface, it gets met by that same machine, that same system, whose job it is to knock it down. And that's just the nature of this beast. Maybe the difference between Tom and I is I don't take that beast as the metaphysical arbiter of reality, in the sense that that beast is doing its job. But that, to me, doesn't necessarily indicate whether something is true in objective reality or not. It means that the beast is fighting that, and the beast hasn't made up its mind what's what yet. But expanding one's thinking a little bit, you can look beyond the beast and think about something based upon putting together other pieces of the puzzle. So that's kind of the difference. So I don't use that scientific, academic, hardcore process. To me, has very little philosophical bearing, but it does have bearing when it comes to the system, the machine, the profitability, and how it affects our day-to-day life. So
am I interpreting your opinion correctly if I was to say that? So you believe then that the idea of the scientific method of falsification, something's immediately taken to be false and therefore and trying to be proven wrong. Do you think therefore that's too limited when it comes to these kind of phenomena?
It's not too limiting when it comes to applying something into the physical world. And that's where this subject hits the conflict, because it's difficult to apply a different dimension of reality into the physical world. Because if we didn't have that system or that machine, then we wouldn't have medicine like we know it. We wouldn't have the progress in our society. I'm sorry?
We wouldn't really have anything, really, would we?
Right.
Technology or...
So it's like that beast is this monster that had to be created, because before that monster, we had the Dark Ages. So, the Enlightenment, in a sense, created, like, we're going to create this monster and it's going to regulate the physical environment around us so that we don't fall back into the Dark Ages. Now, but that same monster, unfortunately, is also programmed to be in opposition to the topics that we talk about, because it's not as quick to demonstrate and prove these topics as it would chemistry, as it would things in this material cosmos. Unless you go into, we can go into metaphysics, and we can go into, even Stephen Hawking was speculating about beings in other dimensions interacting with us that people see as shadow people when they, are half asleep. They see these shadow people in the room. Hawking, before he died, a very interesting essay about that. So smart people, smart physicists, and people can theorize, speculate, look at these concepts, but when it comes to being able to stick it in a laboratory, then it has to come up against the beast. And I think it'll get there eventually. I just think it's going to be, I think it's a really difficult process. And I think what Tom has done here today is represent, in a way, the voice of, the opinions of, the actions of the beast, and what a topic would have to go through to be accepted as something that would affect our material reality without causing issues or causing people to get sick or hurt. And that's the purpose of it.
Tom, would you like to add anything?
No, I agree with everything you said there.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to have to go for Tom again. There is no more for Cyrus. Let me see. So the idea, Tom, that all experiments should be cheap and easy is false. Some phenomena require more sophistication to be observed and analysed. So I'm guessing this is in relation to the Stephen Schwartz experiments.
Gary Schwartz, yeah.
Gary Schwartz.
Yeah, that's totally true. So I'm not saying that like the Large Hadron Collider, you can't do those in your basement. The point here is that if you can give a rudimentary way to test a result that we can show here, that will garner interest to be able to verify more expensive experiments. That's like what the flat earthers did. The flat earthers ended up buying $40,000 laser, forget what they're called, but they can measure the flatness or the equator drift or whatever, and they got the funding for it by starting off and saying, we have these experiments we can do, we do them on YouTube. And they did the crappiest garbage experiments they could possibly do with just rulers and lights and just a camera. But then they got enough funding to be able to buy these $4,000, $10,000, $40,000 pieces of equipment to do the more complicated experiments. So I'm not saying that you should be able to just do the super expensive thing in your basement. I'm saying you just need to give a rudimentary way to build to garner the interest.
Mm-hmm. Okay, brilliant. Tom, if out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and mediumship are products of imagination, how does Tom explain the transformative psychological and emotional changes afterwards, which happen similarly to so many? It's measurable by survey data.
Well, we know that's literally psychological. So any transformative experience you have, people have that on drugs all the time. That's literally one of the most common features you have on drugs. So yeah, that's something we know that's purely psychological. And you can have those from religious experiences. You can have those from experiences with people. You can have those from different kinds of hobbies. We know those happen all the time to all people all over the world for any number of reasons. So we've already demonstrably shown the transformative experiences on your life are literally things in your head.
If I could add to that, when you are going up against the beast, and Tom is representing the arguments of the beast, I don't mean the beast, I'm just referring to the scientific power. That is not probably the kind of argument to make because of exactly everything Tom just said. The psychological world is the subjective world. And the only way to get this topic out of the subjective world is to look at the objective, which is difficult because we're dealing with altered states of consciousness in multi-dimensions. I would have asked I don't mean to like belittle the question, but I want to say that, a better question to ask would be, how do you explain certain cases of police being able to use mediums in an extremely accurate way? I'm familiar with a case here in Arizona where a medium brought police to a body that was like way out in the desert that was buried underneath. I think it was like a blue slide, like an abandoned playground. Very interesting case. There's a lot more of these psychic detective cases involving mediumship that you can get into, and I reference some of them in my books. But there's actually I'll have a medium on my show coming up, hopefully, who works with the police departments. But, that is the nature of the types of arguments to present. If we ask the scientific beast, how do you explain a subjective psychological occurrence, then you're chasing your tail. That's never going to be a strong argument at all. Not to belittle the question. I'm just, it's just the ground that has to be covered.
Yes. So, Tom, I'm wondering what's your thought on the idea of apparently verified psychic detective cases?
There's a reason that we don't use them regularly across the world. It's because they work at about the same rate as chance. So chance does work, but it doesn't work reliably, and that's kind of how we filter out.
And I can demonstrate many cases that are way beyond chance. So again, but you can't compress that down into a debate on YouTube, because I would have to bring up, those specific cases. We don't have time to do that, obviously. You have to actually do the research. You have to look into like a case that I just referenced, which I remember writing and researching that one, like 10 years ago, but I can't necessarily pull it out of my memory banks.
Yeah.
But if you investigate, sometimes as a journalist, it's when you come to answers. And that is also part of the frustrating thing, is that when you approach these topics from a journalistic point of view, you accumulate data that is independent of the scientific beast. The scientific beast is then designed to squash those accounts, but it doesn't change that, hey, this still happened. And that's how dyed-in-the-wool skeptics turn into believers when, for example, you experience something that is way beyond chance. Like you find a body in a playground out in the desert, and there's no way, there's the odds would be billions or trillions to one. So, but again, we can't tackle all that in this debate. So
it wouldn't be fair to debate things like that without both parties knowing the full literature inside and out. Of course.
I'm sorry, what?
It wouldn't be fair to debate the subject without both parties being completely aware of all the literature on the subject.
Yeah, so.
Okay, brilliant. Tom, two more. No, we're nearly there. If out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, and me, I've done that one already. So one more left.
One more left.
I predicted... Oh, right. So this is from Anton, who talks about prophetic dreams from his own experience. He'd like your take on them, Tom. I predicted my first grand mal seizure and me waking up on my carpet in my bedroom. Exactly this happened on exactly that place. Please ask Tom, I suppose, what your opinion is.
I've actually had the same experiences. So that's actually a really common thing where you have a dream or a vision that shows you something that's going to happen in the future. Those are really common. And what happens is that it has a vague similarity in your brain, which then the details are filled in when it has some corollary event in the future. So if you have some block vision in your past and it wasn't very vivid and it could apply to lots of different things, and then in the future you have some event that is similar to that block event, then what happens is your brain takes that block event and fills in all the details to make it seem like it was a really particular vision that you had in the past, which usually it wasn't. Usually it was just very vague, and the idea that it was a very precise prediction is filled in later post hoc, which is why it's not really considered a true prediction.
Right.
And of course, I can go into a lot of research and precognition that is far beyond the realm of chance or any kind of in this case, I guess he's describing an almost neurological cold reading, making a vague statement, and then, slowly things contract down to something that's smaller and tangible. I can cite and go into many, many cases of that, which are, far outside of that category, specific detail types of events. But again, we don't have time. Not everyone is fully read up on that, but I just want to throw that out there for the audience if they want to research both sides, that there's a lot of literature that is in complete contrast, like almost everything Tom said on this debate. There's a lot of literature that's in contrast, but not literature that would be able to withstand the scientific beast smashing it, because to withstand that, you need multiple levels of replication from different academic institutions and funding and a whole cultural shift to take it seriously enough to want to do that. So, but there is data about this, and so people can look that up.
So I wonder, just to add on to that, Tom, do you think that statistical cases like that are well beyond chance, and we just have the cases for it, do you think that they hold any evidential value at all?
If you could demonstrate them, yeah, but saying that something happened beyond chance, like I can predict the lottery numbers for last week's lottery, and that's the chance of that is incredibly low. It's 1 in a billion or whatever, but I could have just looked at them post hoc, and so it's not really. You'd have to demonstrate it actually occurred in the way that you said it occurred to count as evidence.
It can't be replicated and turned into evidence, because when somebody has a precognitive experience, it happens spontaneously by itself. So there's not somebody. Well, I mean, there are some psychics who maybe make the claim, but there's no. Generally speaking, people don't have a at-will precognitive ability. These are episodes that happen that then lead to something. Personally, if you ask me, if you want a woo-woo explanation, I don't think that human beings on a whatever multiverse level, a spiritual level, would be allowed to have access to future knowledge, because it would crumble society. Okay, you would have groups of people getting all the lottery numbers, getting all access to this information that would put them at a huge advantage over everybody else. It would literally, we wouldn't be here today enjoying the life that we have if psychic powers, like if X-Men powers were possible like that. I literally think that it's blocked. It wouldn't be possible to demonstrate that, except it only seems to happen in these experiences like episodes, having a precognitive episode where something specific is then predicted and verifiable, and to the person, not to external people watching it, only to the person. And then, at the journalistic side of it, you can accumulate all those experiences. And so on this spectrum of the debate of the mind, when you accumulate all those experiences, you look at all that data, you think, well, there's something here. And then if you transfer it to the scientific beast, it's going to squash it, but that's the job. The job of the scientific beast is to squash it. But you can't work with that because no one has the ability to on demand create a precognitive experience. So you can't put someone in a lab and be like, predict the future, predict the lottery number. And thank God that doesn't happen like that. The closest we get is the remote viewers who seem to create advantages in business and government, which are outside of chance, and they get paid very, very handsomely for that. But it's just it just doesn't work like that, and that's one of the things that's going to stop some of this field from advancing very fast. That's why things have not advanced much in 100 years.
So Tom, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? And then I know I said that was the last one, but literally as I said that, agnostic, which is a play on words of agnostic, I suppose, did come through with one last one. So if you'd like to add anything to what Cyrus just said, and then we'll go for the last question.
Oh yeah. So the only thing I want to add is that if you don't have a way to tell the difference between it was just a vague mental epileptic seizure that was then post hoc transformed to make it look like a actual prediction versus a true prediction, well, then we should probably conclude it was probably not an actual prediction until you can actually provide a reliable method to differentiate between those two possibilities.
Sure. Okay, and the last question again for Tom. Sorry, Cyrus. Agnostic says he or she is mainly interested if you, Tom, can think of any hypothetical evidence from near-death experience accounts that might get you to reconsider your position.
Novel testable predictions that would cause me to reassess my position on literally anything. So if you can say that under these conditions, we can cause a near-death experience that will then allow us to do something like to see a red shoe on the higher floor, to see a number on a piece of medical equipment, and we can do this experiment reliably and get the results positively, reliably, that's great evidence. That would do it.
Sounds like the film Flatliners, and thank God we're not doing that, because I think that maybe if you're ethical considerations.
It's okay. We're just going to take Cyrus and we're going to suffocate him for a while, see if he sees anything. We'll revive him. We'll be fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think we'll finish it there then. Thanks, Tom and Cyrus, for remaining completely civil between your discussion. As always, that's my main priority on this channel. And you did so beautifully, so thank you both for that. I better just add, Cyrus and Tom, if you'd like to take the opportunity now to let everybody know of any products or services you offer that they can find and where they can find them.
Yeah, sure. You can check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/TJump. Everything's on there. You can see.
Okay. Of course, we have the YouTube Afterlife Topics in Metaphysics Facebook group. I charge only $60,000 an hour for mediumship sessions. You should just sign right up. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I usually I'm usually very critical of that kind of thing. Actually,
yeah. So
we discuss these things on a critical level on the YouTube, on the Facebook group. Also, we have a Reddit page. And what am I forgetting? Oh, of course, I have books too, like Understanding Life After Death was my first book. So
sure. And I'll just add for my own thing, if you'd like to see more of these discussions, then and debates, of course, then please do subscribe to my channel. You can find my Facebook group at just type Seeking Eye and you'll find us. There's also a Patreon link because up to now I funded all this kind of thing myself, but now that it's getting kind of a bit beyond my ability to do that, any support is appreciated. There are rewards associated with certain tiers, so have a look at patreon.com/Seeking Eye, just all one word, I believe, if I remember correctly. Just type in Seeking Eye, you'll find me, and that would be greatly appreciated. So thanks again, Cyrus and Tom. And
thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Thanks for Cyrus for the conversation. It was very pleasant.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.